Hello, my name is Virgil, and this is Literally Books. Today I want to talk about M. John Harrison's first book in the Viriconium series, The Pastel City. Written in 1971, this is a post-apocalyptic fantasy is what I think of it as being. It's very much a fantasy story, maybe better a sword and sorcery story, but all the magic and sorcery has been removed, and instead we have technology. It's the first in a series. The subsequent books take a while to show up. I think the next book that he wrote for this is like he wrote like 9 years later, or comes out 9 years later. So this is kind of a standalone, and having read the second one, this one is a little different in tone. It's a little more simple in tone. Still a very enjoyable read. In this story, we have this kingdom that is under siege by someone who has a claim to the throne. Our main character, Tigius Chromis, or just Chromis, was part of a group that helped install the last, or the current regime, I guess you could say, in the Pastel City, Viriconium. Not too much longer after installing that ruler, he passed away and his daughter assumed the throne. About that time is when Chromis sort of retired from adventuring, from being a hero essentially, and now lives in this tower outside the city where he can see the city from afar, but he doesn't visit the city and hasn't had anything to do with the people or the politics of his past life for a long time. But the city is currently under siege by this invading army. And after a ship crashes not too far from Chromis' tower and he saves someone from the opposing force, and after a kind of exchange where Chromis is sort of says it doesn't matter that we're on opposite sides, I was just sort of saving you, and this invader has nothing to do with that, and still fights Chromis. Chromis wins and decides that he needs to do something. He needs to go back and see what help he can give. It's also through this initial encounter that we see that Chromis is indeed a really excellent swordsman, maybe one of the best swordsmen alive, although we're often told that he considers himself a better poet. Chromis, to me, felt similar to Elric from Michael Moorcock's Elric saga. He's not based on Elric, but he is, or the series is, based on a different Michael Moorcock sword and sorcery series, The End of All Songs. So Chromis goes into the city, and there he encounters Griff and a couple other former adventuring companions of his. After speaking to the queen and somewhat being admonished for not having a presence in these sort of formidable years of hers, he's given her signet ring and is sort of sent out to take command of her army, which is out sort of defending the land. Along the way, Chromis encounters a giant mechanical vulture that can talk. The vulture has a message for Chromis, saying that he must come and see its master right away, that there's an important message waiting for him. Chromis is able to sort of converse with this bird a little bit and sort of get a little bit more information out of it, but ultimately decides that that's probably not that important and sort of lets it go. And right before Chromis finds the queen's army, he has an encounter with a robot in this swamp. And it's there that we learn that these robots might be working for the opposing force and that they steal the brains of those that they kill. Really a fun sword and sorcery story. Definitely has sword and sorcery roots. I mean, it fits much more in the sword and sorcery camp than it is in the fantasy camp. But all the sorceress type stuff, all the magic and all that stuff are replaced with technology and technological advances and things like that, right? You could literally take some of the nouns in this story and just replace them with their fantasy counterparts, and it would just be a pure fantasy or sword and sorcery story. But I really like it. I think it really works well in this tone. It isn't doing anything outrageous, but it also isn't lazy. It's not quite the same sort of breakneck or sort of very action-oriented reading that you get from like Robert E. Howard, but it also is still a sword and sorcery story, so it moves quickly. It's not a long novel. I think in this collection, it's not much over 100 pages. I think the original paperback is only like 150 or 160 pages, so it's not a long story. It moves quickly. It's entertaining. The cast is diverse enough to keep things interesting and different. To especially like one of the characters they encounter later, Tomb the Dwarf. And I think it does enough to really kind of have a unique flavor all of its own. This is similar to something like Jack Vance's Dying Earth. In fact, it's pretty similar to that, or even Gene Wolfe's New Sun. But the sort of after the collapse fantasy that we're getting here is a lot more obvious, right? In Dying Earth, that collapse seems to have happened so long ago that it's like unknowable, right? It's like so many things have happened since, like our time, between our time and the time of the stories in the Dying Earth series, that it's like you can't really figure it out. And in the New Sun series, it seems like that people have accepted and sort of integrated all these sort of changes that have happened, and so it's really obscure as to what they think about as being of the old world and of the current world. So that's why I think that's part of the charm of that series. Here in the Viriconium series in Pastel City, it's pretty obvious. Like, oh, this is an ancient energy sword, or oh, these are airships. We don't know how to make these airships anymore, but we still have them. So I like that it's sort of overt, and so it makes it seem a bit like science fiction, but there's really not much in the way of science fiction concepts in this novel. It's much more sword and sorcery, except at the very end, right? There's something that happens at the very end that is more leaning towards. You couldn't just change the nouns, as I said, with what happens at the very end, and it work quite the same. It has a much more distinct science fiction tone. I also like how Harrison sort of clues us in as to sort of the state of the world, because he says that the current existence is after the fall of the afternoon cultures, which is the human cultures that built the Pastel City, and that this invasion that begins at the beginning of the novel is sort of a destruction of that thing that those cultures built that we can't build anymore. We don't have access to that technology anymore. So I really like the way that that's clued in, and all the imagery in here too is like post-apocalyptic energy, right? The swamp that they're going through is a toxic swamp, and these creatures that sort of roam inside of it are sort of like weird mutated creatures, not mutated in the way that radiation would actually mutate something or chemicals would, right? Like we're just horrible and bad. And just like it just sucks that those creatures must be suffering incredibly. It's more like the cool, like weird mutations, like, oh, it got bigger and it's got sharper fangs, like the really cool metal mutations. Like that's what it's going for, at least a little bit more. The Pastel City doesn't change a whole lot from like a more standard sword and sorcery sort of setting, other than just sort of replacing the fantasy elements with technological elements. But subsequent stories, the next story, for example, A Storm of Wings, definitely leans much heavier into the like speculative fiction side of fantasy and science fiction, right? It's much more. This is science fantasy, but much more into the fantasy side. The next novel jumps way closer to the science fiction side. And is really interesting. It's interesting because we sort of get a taste of it at the end of this novel. Again, sort of probably written as a one-off, I think, that he decided to revisit and sort of like reimagine. I think another inspiration for this, besides Michael Moorcock and Dying Earth, was also Gormenghast, something I need to read. I've been meaning to read that forever. And this story, or this series, and Gormenghast, and probably a few other things written by Michael Moorcock, are sort of like foundational or sort of like blueprints for like new weird type fiction that we get in the early 2000s. So a lot of fun. Definitely something I wanted to talk about first before I go and reread, I should say, China Miéville's Perdido Street Station. So that'll be a lot of fun to revisit that. It's been a long time since I've read that stuff, or read his Boss Lang series, so it'll be really fun to revisit those. And then, of course, swing back and get this second Viriconium book, A Storm of Wings, talk about it too. Thanks very much for watching. My name is Virgil. This is Literally Books. A like and subscribe are always appreciated. Hopefully we'll get a lot more of this stuff done. I still want to talk about all those wonderful fantasy recommendations I got in that Neo Gaming video that I did. Probably just make a part 2, just talk about that. That'll be a little more meandering of a video, a little less tight than the previous one, but that's okay. I think it'd be fun. I think it'd be fun to talk about stuff, to sort of, there's so many great recommendations, right? Like so many things I was like, oh, this sounds so good. Like these are just so many, like this massive stack of recommendations. I'm like, wow, I want to read all this, but I wish I need to read faster. Thanks very much again. That's all for now. Bye.